Okay, everybody, we'll get ready to finish up our final couple of hours here. We're going to move to a conversation that's been very important to us over the past 4 years within NHNAI, and that's really thinking about the marginalized communities. When we think about artificial intelligence and emerging technologies and how they might impact people, we have a tendency, I think, to be able to already think from a position of who's at the table that we might see at the table. And that we always need to broaden that ethical roundtable. We always need to be able to expand it and identify those who might not always have that voice and provide that voice. And so we really wanted to have some of our sessions today focus on these communities that are so important as it relates to humanity and human dignity. So today, David DeCosse, our Director of Religious and Catholic Ethics, is going to run this session, and he'll introduce, of course, his panelist, who's joining us, as you can see and tell from far away, but really looking forward to this next hour. So thank you, David.
Thank you so much, Thor. So I am really so excited to welcome and introduce our next speaker. Elizabeth Tellman is the Joint Assistant Professor in the Department of Hydrology and Atmospheric Sciences and in the School of Geography, Development, and Environment at the University of Arizona. Her work seeks to address the causes and consequences of global environmental change for vulnerable populations, with a focus on illicit activities, flood risk, water scarcity, and land use change. She is the co-founder and chief science officer at Cloud to Street. She also runs a lab called the Tellman Lab that uses data-driven approaches to understand human environmental change and assess the potential for new technologies to help reduce risk with and for marginalized populations. Tellman has published widely, including recent papers on sensitivity to data choice for index-based flood insurance and for remote sensing and political geography, scalar flexibility, the ethics of exposure, and critiques of the state. She received her PhD from Arizona State University, a master's degree from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Science, and, big, huge drum roll here, her bachelor's degree from Santa Clara University in 2009. And Beth, when she was here, was a Hackworth Fellow for her senior year at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics. We are so happy she's here and so proud of her for all of her great work. I will say this presentation is perhaps a little different from earlier ones. We're really going to hear from a scholar about how all this digital stuff gets applied to people in the world. Also, just like to note as a little brief context setting that for the last 2 years, the Markkula Center has dedicated its Environmental Ethics Fellowship to an interdisciplinary project looking at a catastrophic flood in the farm worker town of Pajaro, California, where there was a disastrous atmospheric river in March of 2023 that broke the levee that protected that town and caused all sorts of damage. But beyond that one town, California has 14,000 miles of levees, often unknown data point. Many of those levees are officially designated as substandard or very substandard. In the United States itself, disproportionate numbers of poor communities live behind levees, and climate change is expected to increase by 25% flood damage by the year 2050. I do not mean to funnel Beth's work into those data points at all, but I just want to note them because Beth's topic is really not far for us from our home here in California. So with great joy, I turn it over to Professor Elizabeth Tellman, please.
Thanks so much. And so great to be here, at least digitally. Sorry, I'm not in person. I'm in the toddler phase of life. I have a 1- and 3-year-old, and it just makes travel really, really hard right now. But I'm really glad. The one great thing for me about the pandemic and kind of being a young woman and mom in science is we can still engage without traveling. So that's a really great opportunity for me. I'm going to share my screen here. Just make sure these slides are all good. You can see this, I think. I'm just going to, all right, cool. All right, so what I'm going to talk about today is understanding flood risk with satellite data. So I use AI with satellite data to address adaptation and environmental injustice related to flooding. So that's what we'll talk about today. And I'm going to talk about this from two perspectives. One is work I do at the university. We actually call my lab the Social Pixel Lab, which I'll talk more about in a minute, but also a company I started. We rebranded to Floodbase about a year ago, but what David kind of mentioned, a company called, well, it was formerly called Cloud to Street that I started about a decade ago. But before I get into the content of today's talk, I just want to talk about where I'm coming from physically and the land that I'm on. So the University of Arizona is on the land and territories of indigenous peoples. There are 22 federally recognized tribes here, and Tucson, the city that I live in, is home to the Otham and the Yaqui nations. A little bit more about me. So I actually have this proudly hanging, you can kind of see, behind my computer. And this is the university's Worst Nightmare Award, which I was awarded by SCAP. I hope SCAP still exists. I don't know if it still has the same name, but the sort of kind of community service and social justice organization on campus. And the reason they gave me this award is because I did a lot of protesting and kind of good kinds of troublemaking when I was a student. And I worked with the Markkula Center a lot, actually, as an ethics fellow in 2009. So this is a picture of me. I don't know if the food service contract is still Bon Appetit, but they were trying to renegotiate their contract and have better justice for their healthcare. So we did like boycotts of Bon Appetit, and we did this sort of rally right outside of the student union and had these sort of red X's that we would wear in solidarity with the workers. And we had the workers actually tell their stories on this stage. And then this is some of the workers that I worked with at the time. And they gave me kind of another award when I graduated. So those are the experiences for me, actually, beyond just the education in the classroom part of being at Santa Clara, that I feel like was some of the most important, as well as being able to study abroad in El Salvador and Thailand in those programs. I also worked with Leslie Gray, who helped me make up my own major, which we called Sustainable Globalization, which is kind of funny now, but helped me write my first paper and get a Fulbright scholarship to go to El Salvador, where I ended up living for 4 years. And when I started my Fulbright, this is right after my graduation from Santa Clara, there were horrible landslides and floods that impacted the community that I was supposed to be studying fair trade coffee farming in. And you know, when you get called to dig people and bodies out of homes, coffee farming kind of becomes less important than sort of questions about survival and well-being. And I noticed all of these crazy dynamics as I got really involved in aid and disaster relief. I ended up raising money and starting a small nonprofit and living there for 4 years, rebuilding with these communities. And things that I noticed, no risk maps, no flood risk maps available in these locations, or maps of where the flooding was. That really allowed the mayor to politicize disaster aid and only give World Food Program relief to his voters and supporters instead of the people actually impacted by the flood. And I noticed a lot of deforestation and informal urbanization. So thinking about who lives in the flood and landslide zone, who chooses to live there or not, and why, and all of the land change sort of happening around that could have impacted where those floodwaters went. So that experience and those questions are what drive me as a scientist now. It's what drove me back to grad school. And I think they're the questions I'll be working on probably for the rest of my life. This is the organization we started, Colectivo Ceiba, and I was doing disaster relief and reconstruction with community leaders in this region. And this really kind of led me back to school. And I use satellites to study land changes like deforestation and urbanization, and I continue to work on flooding issues, which we'll talk about today. But I don't like to just publish papers and analyze data. I'm always thinking about what do we do about this problem and with whom do I need to work to leverage those science for a solution. So I work with my local regional flood control district here in Pima County in Arizona. I work with lawyers. We'll talk about some of that work today. Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid. I think scientists working with lawyers is such an interesting and important collaboration when we think about doing environmental justice as a verb, really doing the work and not just publishing another kind of study about environmental justice. And I'll talk a little bit about my company, Floodbase. But there's other kind of organizations that my lab has historically worked with, the government of Bangladesh, and others. And we call our lab the Social Pixel Lab because we're really kind of positioned between the science of hydrology, social sciences, and remote sensing, and thinking about, well, how do satellite images capture really important environmental change, and how do we use that data to improve human well-being and partner with others outside of the academy. My company Floodbase focuses specifically on flood insurance and using AI to work on insurance issues. So I'll talk about that a little bit later on in this talk as well. With Floodbase, we've worked all over the world working, building flood monitoring tools, both for governments, and I'll tell a couple of those stories today, and as working in parametric insurance, which I'll explain a little bit later. But the themes that I'm going to go through kind of in this talk is to think about, when we think about flood risk and digital dignity, sort of the theme today, how do we use satellites to understand where is exposure growing? What or who shapes where flood exposure grows? And what does dignity and justice mean, or what could it mean in flood adaptation and recovery? And how can we use AI and satellite data to assist those efforts? So the way that I kind of think about, David asked me to define thinking about dignity sort of in my work and flood-related work. I really think about disasters generally in sort of this concept from the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They write a report about every 5 to 7 years on sort of the state of the world, and their framework on hazards, vulnerability, exposure, and response is how I tend to think about things. So when we think about dignity and flood exposure, that's this side of the equation, we think about what or who lives where in harm's way, and why are they there? Is there agency in where people live? Do they have a choice in where they're living? Do they have information about, is this a flood zone or not? Do they have the money available to make a choice? Yes, I do or don't want to live in a flood zone. Is there participation in where cities are growing and urban planning happens? And I'll talk about some of those themes today in my research. When we talk about dignity and flood vulnerability, vulnerability really is about the sensitivity to loss when a disaster happens. So we could think about access to capital for mitigation, flood mitigation, like raising your home or building a levee, recovery money. So this is money to recuperate losses, either through an insurance mechanism or recovery supported from the government. We could think about early warning systems. Are they being communicated effectively in one's native language, for example? So there's a lot of kind of issues when we think about dignity and both exposure and vulnerability. That's kind of how I'm going to think about it today. When we look at the top, take a kind of step deeper and look at the topic of flooding and justice, this sort of is just a summary of some of the recent research on the topic and where we know injustice is kind of at play in flooding. One thing we know is that inequality and racism increase death and damage from floods. So studies show that it's actually the countries that are the most unequal where you have increased mortality from floods, not just the poorest countries. Why does inequality matter? Because the hypothesis is there's sort of this spatial segregation that happens where wealthier communities protect themselves at the expense of poorer ones. And so you end up having this super concentration of vulnerability and really unequal societies. We also know that people of color are more likely to have higher damage from the same size flood in the US as wider communities. And there are so many reasons for this. Structural racism is a big part of why this happens. Redlining and xenophobia really influence where infrastructure does and doesn't get built, and where floodwaters go. Cost benefit analysis, and this we'll talk about in a minute in the Pajaro case, denies systematically low income communities from flood mitigation infrastructure. And there is less access to information about where floods happen in communities of color. And we also have another issue of wealthy developers actually removing their properties from the FEMA flood map. So even changing our understanding of who is at risk. We also know that flood recovery money in the US is more accessible to wealthier, wider populations due to procedural vulnerability and racism. And I'll get into that a little bit later on. And climate change will disproportionately impact Black populations in the US. So really clear kind of calls for work that needs to be done in really so many areas on this issue. And I'll just dive deeper into the Pajaro one, since it's one I think you all know well, and one that I know David DeCosse of the Markkula Center and others at Santa Clara have worked on, is that the levee that was slated to potentially be rebuilt, that was known to be vulnerable in this region of California, was not prioritized because it did not pass a cost-benefit ratio because it's a low-income area. And this has systematically shaped who gets access to levees that work and don't across this country. And it was slated, I believe, this levee, the state was finally going to pitch in a little bit of extra money, and it was slated to get rebuilt, I think 6 months after it actually broke, but it was too late. And in my work in trying to understand flood justice and all of the different people that are working on it from different disciplines inside academia and outside academia, we held an event about 2 years ago at the University of Arizona, really reflecting on what needs to be done. And we came up with 5 themes where we think researchers and those outside academia could work together on. One is generating better flood data and filling the gaps for the communities where it doesn't exist today, addressing risky urban development, rethinking unfair flood metrics like cost-benefit analysis to drive infrastructure decisions, a big focus on transboundary flooding. So here we're thinking in Arizona a lot about flooding that happens on the US-Mexico border, but this could apply to many other cases, and what it means to really center co-production in flood knowledge and not just have scientists making up ideas and solutions and handing them to people, but actually have co-constructed knowledge and knowledge from outside academia and local knowledge that's valued. And we were really excited to take this to the next level. We got funding from the National Science Foundation for over 5 years to build a research coordination network to work on these themes, but it was terminated on Friday. So this is sort of the next theme I want to talk about in this talk is what's the federal context right now that I think is really threatening some of the progress we were making or trying to make on flood justice specifically and digital tools to address some of these issues. So I think if we want to reflect on where our current reality, it's just really important to look at this. And I know there's a barrage in the media every day about all of the crazy things that are happening, but I just wanted to pull it together for you all just to spend a couple of minutes looking at what's happening and how that relates to this topic of flooding and digital dignity. One is, I think, the termination of awards by the National Science Foundation include a lot of flood-related research, like my own, and the proposed budget cuts, and also just announced today the overhead cuts of the National Science Foundation from 50% to 15% is really going to slam our public research universities and hamper all research, including flooding in the US. And if you look at a word cloud of the NSF awards that were terminated, you could actually go to this website where there's a database of the over 1,000 now terminated awards. We can see the trends of what was terminated. the award kind of word most common is the word Black. And so I think we all need to reflect on, how do these sort of attacks against DEI end up resulting in anti-Black racism and attacks. My guess is, I don't know the PIs on these projects, but probably on a lot of scholars of color who have lost funding and people who are specifically working on environmental justice issues. And you can see some of those other terms in this word cloud. We look at what's going on at FEMA. FEMA ended its BRIC program. This was building resilient infrastructure in communities. It was $5 billion in funding. This was the source of public funding for flood mitigation projects for most communities in the US. Losing this is devastating, and there were a lot of grants in process that were also terminated. So all sorts of waste of kind of half-built projects that will never get finished because of this. Rejecting national disaster declaration. So this just happened last month. The governor of Arkansas requested a disaster declaration. The president denied it. The reason those declarations matter is because when there's a declaration, the federal government will step in and do a cost share with the state. And you also need a disaster declaration to unlock a lot of FEMA's federal assistance programs. Not doing that is going to be really problematic and already has been. There was a lot of funding cut for Helene victims in North Carolina. There were 1,200 people that were sheltered who didn't have a house that were no longer supported. North Carolina was supposed to get $200 million back on its debris cleanup and did not. And then the federally funded construction, there was a management standard that was passed in about 2015 saying that any money spent to build a building with federal dollars couldn't increase flood risk, which seems like a really good policy, but that's now been rolled back. What's going on at NOAA? We just saw kind of with the recent tornadoes in the Midwest, there was no damage assessment done after those, which is typically done. Potential elimination of the Global Fluid Dynamics Laboratory at Princeton, which houses most of the climate change models in the US. All of this whiplash on sort of canceled local weather centers and cloud contracts, and then that coming back online, and proposals sort of mass privatization of weather services. And this sort of was just out this morning from CNN that there are currently 30 National Weather Service offices without a chief meteorologist. So as we are about to go into the summer storm, tornado, and hurricane season, this is going to affect a lot of people. These early warnings are really critical to save life. We don't yet know what's going to happen at NASA, but there are proposed large cuts. One of my students' grants that I'll talk about in this project, we did receive a stop work order on our flood justice project, but it got rescinded a month later. So we'll see how long we can hold on to this work. And also the 6th National Climate Assessment was essentially canceled, and all the scientists working on it were dismissed. As you know, U.S. aid was eliminated. The reason that matters kind of for flooding is, one, I think FuseNet, which did famine prediction in sub-Saharan Africa, was eliminated. That was an incredibly important resource to a lot of aid agencies and governments. Because the U.S. isn't funding the World Food Program anymore, they're eliminating 25 to 30% of their staff. That is critical in giving food aid to flood victims. And my company actually had a big contract with USAID on flood insurance programs in Malawi and Mozambique. That's also gone, and so many other things that affect dignity related to flooding. And then just this morning, it was announced that they would shutter 25 water centers for the USGS. This potentially could cause thousands of stream gauges that are operated in these centers to be closed if no one can operate them. And that, if that would happen, that would eliminate essentially the US flood forecasting and warning system. So there's a lot happening right now that affects the way we think about flooding and digital dignity, and even the data that I use that is at risk. And so I would be remiss to not sort of review the current context in which we're talking about this topic and how important it is, I think, for all of us to continue to be calling our senators and reps to be in the streets and to be doing what we need to do to make sure we save some of these data sources to ensure digital dignity. Okay, so with that sort of context of a little doomsday of what's going on, let me talk about something maybe a little more positive, which is how we're using data in AI. So I want to start with why satellites are so interesting and so useful when we look at flooding. Flood models just measure and estimate where floods could happen and try to model where water flows over the surface of the earth. But satellites are taking a picture of where water was. And that's really useful observation data. And since we have more satellites launched every year, we have more data than we ever have had to look at these disasters. And I want to just take you through looking at a couple of satellite images so you can see and get a feel for the kind of data that I'm talking about if you've never worked with this imagery before. And you can also go to this kind of app or link at the bottom of my screen if you want to play around with this imagery yourself. We built an app to do so. What you're looking at here is called a false color composite. And what that means is that vegetation is going to appear very red and flood water is going to appear kind of dark, black, or green. So these kind of dark areas here, these are floodwaters in this image. This is the same image in the Rio Grande Valley, Texas, taken before a flood. So you can sort of compare before the flood and during. You can see this irrigation canal here is all filled up and all of this water spilling over into these communities here. The little white dots you see, these are people's houses, okay? So this is a neighborhood here, and you can kind of see this ring of flooding around this area. And what my lab does is develops algorithms to extract what the flood footprint is in this image, and you can see it here in blue. And if we compare the flood that happened in this event and look at, say, FEMA flood maps, this is the 100-year floodplain map from FEMA, we can see a couple of things on this map. One, on the left-hand side, this is Hidalgo County, doesn't have a digitized FEMA flood map, so there is no information to look at. And on the right-hand side, we can see this, I believe, is Cameron County, does, but they're really under predicting a lot of the flooding that's happening. We can sort of see all of this water here that's being captured in the satellite image. So satellites are capturing something that models really struggle to capture. If we look at some fancy commercial models, one of the best is from Fathom and from the First Street Foundation. This is available now on a lot of real estate websites. When you look at sort of your flood risk factor, it's using this data to do so. So this is a flood depth map from the 100-year flood, and still it's really under predicting the flood water that happened in this flood in Texas. And so we're just getting a lot from satellite data here that's really useful. I don't want to kind of bore you too much with the methodological details, but feel free to ask me more in the Q&A. But I did want to say a few things about how we use AI, since that's been a lot of the topic of your conversations today. We are using an algorithm mostly called a convolutional neural network to extract water features from many different satellite images that are at different spatial and temporal resolutions. And if you haven't worked with convolutional neural networks, I just want to walk you through a little bit how these types of algorithms work. So I'm going to use the metaphor of spatial recognition technology, which is where a lot of this originated. So what's really happening in a convolutional neural network is it is running mathematical operations called convolutions in a moving window around an image. And it starts first by extracting these really small features and in kind of this first layer. So these are really obvious things like curves and lines and things that sort of pop out as really high variance features at this level. And these get put together to make a higher level feature, something more complex like an eyes or a nose. And that eventually gets put together to make an entire human face. So the same thing is sort of happening a little bit behind the scenes when we are making an algorithm to recognize flooding. The algorithm is making features that sort of map how floodwater looks different in an agricultural field, like here, versus a desert, the way the flood pattern looks here, and is doing a much better job of picking out these sort of meta patterns of what flooding looks like in different places. And it's a really effective way of making a flood map. And if we take advantage of some higher resolution commercial satellite sensors. This is another example here of PlanetScope. These are the images. This is sort of a hand-labeled image of where the water is, and this is a public sensor. You can see all of this water we can see in the commercial higher resolution sensor that the public sensors can't pick up. And we do a lot of tricks in my lab, like training these, using data to train using commercial sensors on public sensors and increasing accuracy so that others can take advantage of those features in their own machine learning. One of the most important studies, if not the most important study that we've done, that I've been involved in, is looking at flooding around the world. So we made a map. We mapped nearly 1,000 floods around the planet. And what we found when we did that was there were many more people rebuilding in places we saw flood over a period of about 2 decades than a flood model was predicting. So clearly there was something about flood risk and exposure and where people were rebuilding in floodplains that satellites could pick up on that flood models could not. This is called the Global Flood Database, and this is publicly available data. If you sort of Google Global Flood Database, you'll see this website where you can see a drop down and look at floods that we've mapped all around the world, and you can download any of those flood events yourself. But if you combine all of those events together, what we noticed is that this is population data. In blue, it's where population is lost, and where red is where population has gained, that there were places around the world, like New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, where the population had decreased. Other places, like Manaus, Brazil, where we saw the population stay pretty much constant before and after flood events happened. But in Dhaka, Bangladesh, or Guwahati, India, huge increases of population in places that had flooded. And that was sort of this pattern that we noticed around the world. So this sort of begs a question of thinking about why is flood risk increasing and for whom, and why do we see that pattern exist? And why do we see this sort of increase in built up urbanized area in very high, some of the highest levels of flood hazard and risk around the world? And climate change certainly is one of the factors in seeing larger floods. Structural racism, inequality, definitely shaping exposure of who has drainage infrastructure and who has not, and vulnerability, recovery, and adaptation as well. But there's also just the fact that urbanization is happening in floodplains, and I wanted to look deeper at that question. Why and how and who is really shaping that urban growth and flood exposure? And I wanted to start looking at that in the US, actually. So there's a lot of wonderful reporting, investigative reporting that came out of Houston after Hurricane Harvey that really caught my attention about everyone knowing Houston's reservoirs were flood except the people who bought houses there. And talk and discussions of Army Corps of Engineers getting kickbacks and making a good living, quote unquote, working with developers, and lack of enforcement of these zones. So I wrote a project, this is an NSF career project, to take a look at that. And I want to kind of show you how I systematically plan to do that. Okay, so when FEMA makes a flood map, with it comes a requirement to purchase insurance if you're going to take out a mortgage in that area. Some of you who are homeowners are maybe already familiar with this process. And it will affect land values, of course, if you're in a flood area. And so for some real estate developers, they don't want that decrease in their land value, and they like to amend the flood zone. And the way that you do it is you write a letter of map revision. So if you can prove that you have built a culvert or done some infill or done something special to a piece of land and brought it out of a flood zone, then the flood zone here, this is zone AO, can be revised. You can see all of these kind of areas in white get taken out of the flood zone. So this is just one example where this was done from a company called Metro National that built homes in this floodplain that the city council approved. But when people actually investigated this, they found that it was the culvert that Metro National said they built for flood mitigation was never actually built. And someone flew a LiDAR plane and was able to do analysis and see that a lot of the information was falsified, that the digital elevation map was falsely raised, and that this approval really shouldn't have happened. But this kind of thing happens all of the time, all across the US. And if we just look at Texas, there are millions of changes since 1985 to the FEMA flood maps. Almost all of these requests for changes get approved, 86%. And Texas is a real hot spot of where this is happening. And so I was just starting to do this work with my postdoc, Seth Bryant, who's systematically analyzing all of these FEMA floodplain maps and this data. But this project was also terminated 2 weeks ago. And what we were planning to do was first look at where the floodplain was changing, and then we were going to combine that with satellite data and say, you know, if the real estate developer said they had mitigated flooding, did they really do it? Can we see evidence after a flood in the satellite data that they slowed down or stopped the floodwater? Or can we see evidence that maybe they did build that levee or culvert, but they just pushed the floodwater downstream to somebody else? And if that happened, where did it go and who did that impact? And so we were planning to track and see if that was occurring. And then the education component of this award, we were going to train 10 fellows in my lab to learn machine learning and make flood maps themselves and think about how they could leverage that data within their own organizations, paired with an undergraduate class to help them build these projects. And then we had this NASA internship where students were going to get paid for a year to continue to do this work. But all of that got terminated. We just had started this project in January. So I'm appealing that termination. It's illegal, but we'll see if I can continue that work and how. Send grants my way, you know, foundations that are interested in funding federally terminated contracts and awards. Okay, and on that sad note, I'm going to show a couple of other examples where we're not just using AI and flood data to look at and quantify issues of injustice, but actually do something about it. So I first want to talk about my student Lucas Belluri's work. This is my doctoral student. He's living right now in the Rio Grande Valley of South Texas. And he's asking if satellite data can be used to challenge flood injustice. And I want to tell you some context about this location. This is a place where there's a lot of informal urban development, maybe like there is in the Central Valley in California as well. They're called colonias, and they chronically flood. And after real major flooding in 2008, after Hurricane Dolly, people's flood claims were getting denied. And they were talking to community-based organizations there. Lupe, which is a really well-known one, La Unión del Pueblo Entero, founded by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, were looking at, hey, why is everybody getting systematically denied? Teamed up with lawyers from Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid and found that FEMA was actually training their staff to go into these homes and say, you know, you can't tell if these people are just poor and didn't upkeep their floor versus it flooded. Just write down deferred maintenance and we don't have to pay that flood claim. And that was happening systematically at rates of 85%. So lawyers sued FEMA, they won, and a cash settlement was given to households 10 years later. And so it got really, that story that Lucas knew sort of got him thinking with Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid, what if we had satellite data? Could you have done that class action lawsuit quicker? Could we have prevented a lawsuit from needing to happen and really get people's flood recovery money back in the first place? So we decided to start a project called Flujos, Flood Justice Utilizing Satellite Observation. And what we do, or have been doing with communities in this area, is outlining their theories of change for flood justice, developing tools using satellite data, developing a database that they help define what are the floods that matter to me in my location. We actually take their lived experiences of flooding and use that to train the machine learning algorithm that makes the flood map. And then Lucas is there now assessing impact of that tool and seeing how different actors are using it for the theories of change they said they wanted to use satellite-based flood maps for: advocacy in declaring disasters, fundraising efforts and grant applications, focusing efforts on titling. So if you don't have a legal title to your home, you're not entitled to get FEMA recovery money. And so nonprofits wanted to know, where should I focus my titling efforts? Where are the floods that are happening? And for other community empowerment efforts. And the machine learning technique that we use here is called human in the loop. And so what we do, this is my postdoc, he's actually now a professor at Utah State, JJ Zhang. He is taking our flood maps with community members and nonprofits, and they're drawing where the errors are on the map in purple, looking at our predictions in blue. And he's taking those, and then we're resampling the data and retraining the algorithm so that the old algorithm that we showed them before we had their lived experiences in January maps flooding here in orange. And the new algorithm, after we had their experiences, maps flooding in blue. And we can see all of these differences where we're now able to capture the flooding the model had missed earlier. So it's more accurate data, and it also reflects the experiences they've lived. We also do user app testing and iteration and human-centered design. So we did this work with Development Seed to develop our flood tool. So figuring out how we wanted to change the tool so that they could use it. And then it resulted in this database. So I'm just going to pull that up quickly and show you before I end here. You could check this out yourself. This is the Spanish version. I guess I can show you the English one, maybe is better. And it allows folks to select a flood event. This is Hurricane Hannah. And then they can zoom in. You can even type in, if you wanted, your local community. Let's see if we have Milose here. And zoom into that area, and you can see the flood water in blue and satellite data below in that area. So this is a tool kind of we developed with them to their specs. And it kind of discusses the tool and how it should be used. So we're continuing to develop that and add more events. There was actually a large flooding event that happened this March, and organizations were already using this tool to look at where floods have happened in the past and where the floods might be now, as they're kind of waiting for us to develop flood maps of this current event, which we're running. So that's Flujos. I was going to give some examples from my company, but I think for time, I'm maybe going to skip them for now. The only thing that I'll mention really quickly is that I think insurance is a really interesting part of filling in financial gaps where they don't exist today. And when we think about financial safety nets, I think it is part of dignity. I'm going to skip some of these stories. But my company has gotten really involved in something called parametric flood insurance. And one of the first places we're doing it in the US is in California. So I'll just tell this story and then end. Because it's so close to Santa Clara, I've got to tell this one. So the city of Fremont, and actually all municipalities in California, are required to buy flood insurance. But the only thing that insures is their physical building, like where their offices are. But that's not what they want insurance from. They want insurance from what they lose in the event. Lost tax revenue from retail, reductions in retail and tourism. And they also want the money to do things that don't just affect their building, but to do cleanup in other parts of the city. So Fremont was the first city to buy this new type of insurance policy that's based on satellite data that pays them out when part of Fremont gets flooded. If 8.7% area or more, and this is based on historical modeling we've done with satellites, gets flooded, the city of Fremont gets a payout. Monterey's considering buying a policy, Anaheim, and there's actually 100 other municipalities in California that are interested in this type of protection, and they can use it for whatever they want. So it's a unique disaster financing mechanism that I think is really interesting. And this policy would have paid out for Fremont in the large floods that happened there, both in 1998 and 2017. I'm going to skip some of these other things and close and just say that I think that there's a lot that satellite data and AI have to offer in increasing access and information about where floods are happening, that people don't have that information today regarding, and helping people make choices if they have the capital to do so on where to live, and understanding how urban growth affects flooding. I also think that satellite data can really help enable financial recovery, both to know who's flooded, used as kind of data in court cases or appended to aid appeals, and also to support new types of financial mechanisms where insurance can't exist today. So thanks to everyone who's collaborated with me and funded this different parts of these research, and I'll stop here so we can have a discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Beth. So please, if you have a question, if you could write it on the card, and Thor, Monica can pick it up. And Beth, thank you so much. It's just so incredibly rich and just a perfect application of so many ideas that we were talking about earlier, and seeing their positive effects possibly in disaster situations, and also seeing the political forces pushing back so strongly against this good work right now. So I have a question to get us going here, which is, could you say a word regarding the implications of climate change in general on flooding, and in particular for global refugee flows and forced migration? What role could AI play in responding to that connection of flooding and migration flows?
Yeah. Well, I actually have one of my students, Elisa Rayano Thompson, is doing fieldwork in Honduras right now, asking that question. So what she's sort of seeing in her work in Honduras, and she actually she did her master's at Texas State and did a lot of work on the U.S. Mexico border there in Texas. And what she sort of has found in her research is that climate change was sort of like the straw that broke the camel's back, in the sense of increasing floods and droughts being coupled with other forces of sort of violence and dispossession in rural areas of Central America. But what she also is seeing is sort of this chain pattern of displacement. So, flood risk in rural areas in Honduras where she works, pushing people into cities like San Pedro Sula. This is sort of where most of her field work is. And getting re-exposed to floods in the slums and informal communities of San Pedro Sula, people coming north through Texas and the U.S. And she actually saw refugee camps in Mexico and Texas get flooded again. So this sort of triple and almost quadruple exposure. Then as people are resettling in marginalized areas of the United States, sort of flooding following them again into some of those places. And so we sort of see this chain, I think, when we think about movement of people potentially within their own country and to other countries, and those climate impacts sort of following along that chain. And so the way she's really thinking about it is, it's not just understanding like, will climate change cause more people to come to the US, but what are sort of all of these different points where there's exposure? Her use of AI in doing that is, she's using AI to make these flood maps in my lab so that she can combine that with data on migration and internal displacement to understand and make these connections. She's also using AI to look at the urban growth of San Pedro Sula. So that's sort of one example that I can give in how it's helpful in, making the data that we would want to use to understand and assess those connections. That's how I've used it sort of in my work. I would also say like AI generally is just becoming used in so many aspects of environmental science. Google just released about a year ago the first totally AI global climate circulation model. That's pretty exciting. And they have a new model called geospatial reasoning, which does a lot more kind of AI and disaster response and understanding these changes. So AI definitely helps us kind of sift through the data and make better models and make better sort of connections. But the response of, what do you actually do about this problem beyond just understanding it and quantifying it more. You know, AI can be helpful there, but what that really relies on is, of course, the kind of people in decision-making positions that are able and want to respond. And part of, I sort of skipped this part for time in the talk, but part of where I got so interested in insurance is because we would make these awesome flood maps for the government in the Republic of Congo. They were like, great, we now know who's flooded. It used to take us 3 to 4 weeks because we'd have to like take a boat up the river and assess the situation. And now we know in a day. But we can't do anything about it because with what money am I going to respond to this hazard? And so that's sort of how I got into understanding better disaster risk financing and insurance. And so I think the trick really in making AI matter for people is you've got to think through the sort of decision chain or the theory of change and what is your AI data going to do in that situation to respond beyond just sort of making better data.
Thank you so much, Beth. A question here about the very grim listing of funding that's been canceled, including, of course, these wonderful projects that you have designed. And the question is, could some state governments, and I can add like also other, foundations, things, take over at least some of the funding that has been coming from the federal government for this purpose? Or more generally, what possibilities do you see there in the face of this catastrophic cutback at the federal level?
Yeah, we're going to have to get pretty creative. One of my postdocs just sent me today, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which has funded a lot of work on racial and health justice, just released a call for researchers to submit terminated federal grants that they'll consider funding, especially for grants that are led by scholars of color or have folks on their leadership team who are people of color. And so that's the first I've really seen of that, of a foundation stepping up and saying, hey, we're going to step in here a little bit. But philanthropy can't totally plug the gap. I think we can do a little bit. And I think any little bit that can happen is really, really important. Yeah, we're going to have to get creative and what foundations and philanthropy can do and what states can do in this situation. It's going to be really hard, I think, for internal universities to kind of have their own pots of funding. So we're going to have to think about what is the work that really matters and the research we want to fund. What I think is harder, though, is sort of replacing things like the NASA satellites or the USGS stream gauges. If those get turned off, I don't think there's a lot that sort of foundations and philanthropy can do. Those levers, I think, have to be political, and we have to do good work, I think, communicating to our members of Congress that those are things worth saving. So, yeah. But philanthropy and state, I think, can play a really important role.
Thank you.
Back up some of this research, but it's going to be a lot. It's too much, I think. And that, NSF canceled $1 billion in funding just over the past 2 weeks.
Well, thank you so much, Beth. Also, throughout the day, previous to your talk, we've been hearing many people, of course, speaking about all of the problems attached to data sets that AI is trained on. So I was struck in your talk. You talked about data from satellites, developing data from communities, talking to people, incorporating that data. Could you comment, like in your work on flooding, how have you encountered sort of this problem of problematic data sets being fed into AI, and how do you address that?
So let me see if I have a backup slide on this here. So we make our own data. Let me show you kind of what that looks like. It's different, I think, than the large language models. Oh, I don't have a good backup of this. Actually, I'll at least show this. So the way my lab trains these algorithms is we sample satellite imagery around the world and we hand paint in the data. Oh, I actually did have a slide on this kind of at the beginning of my talk. Here. So we do the labor. It is paid labor of undergraduate students that I paid at the University of Arizona that we trained, and they systematically hand painted in this. So it was labor that they were remunerated for. What is interesting, though, I think in the remote sensing space, what we're starting to see is less and less supervised labeled data is needed. And there's a kind of a new trend called foundation models, where basically big companies are analyzing, like 70 million images of satellite data, picking out and saving the patterns. They're called embeddings, and then letting other people use those to make models. And so much less labeled data is needed than used to be in order to make machine learning work, because the machine learning community is starting to share these foundation models. So it's increasing accuracy, and it's also reducing a lot of computation cost. IBM just released one last week called TerraMind. They had one earlier they built with NASA called Privy. Clay is one that was released by Development Seed. And so there's like 15 to 20 of these foundation models now that we're relying on to use less and less labeled data. So maybe different kind of ethical issues, and it's a little more straightforward, perhaps, the work that we're doing. I think the ethical issues are less about, people not being remunerated for doing the labeling, or because that's sort of a direct source, and we also pay everybody that comes to a community workshop. That's like baseline community engagement research ethics in my lab. But just thinking about the climate emissions from AI, I think is a real serious one. I mean, data centers are the new fracking, and that's like a specific news headline that I'm quoting. And so I think we have to ask questions about, is all of this accuracy in AI we're using worth it in the climate emissions we're reducing? Those to me are the tougher ethical issues in my field, less so than the training data itself, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you so much. So a last question, Beth, in the question going back to your time here at Santa Clara, and just a hypothetical, or perhaps not such a hypothetical, imagine you're a student now, today at Santa Clara, interested in AI, committed to a sense of dignity, trying to combine these things in going out into the world. What's a general recommendation you have for where such a students should sort of go?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously you gotta have the skills, right? So take the classes in that. Super glad that I took Iris Stewart Frey's GIS class as part of my environmental studies major. You gotta have those data skills, of course, but the other thing you have to have is being in touch with reality and listening to people's stories. And you get that a little bit, maybe if there's still sort of a service-based learning component. I certainly had that in the classroom, especially in my Spanish classes at Santa Clara, working at day worker centers. But really it was my time at SCAP and working with the union on campus and hanging out with the cafeteria workers that I got way better sense of reality and what was really going on in the world. And so it's what you're doing outside the classroom, I think, that ends up really putting you in touch with people's needs. And there are things that you would never guess, I'll give one this is an example I like to give a lot as something that surprised me as being really important when you're thinking about applying digital technology. When we were working in the East Nile Basin with my company, we had made all of these flood maps in South Sudan, and we thought, yeah, data transparency, let's put this on a website and let everybody use it. And someone we talked to from the Red Cross was like, why don't you reconsider that? Consider not doing that, because if you do that, then the militias will potentially use that to see what riverbeds have dried up and when they can cross to be burning down villages. And, I hadn't thought about my data used to be a source of kind of violence towards others. And I wouldn't have known that had I not spent time with someone from the Red Cross who kind of really worked in that area in those communities. So you'll just never uncover truly the potential, or I think even worse, the kind of pitfalls and harms of your data if you don't spend time with people in those places. And that you've got to do outside the classroom.
Well, Beth, that's a perfect place for us to end. We have this amazing AI technology, but as you're saying, we can never separate it from the concrete dignity of human beings for whom it, we hope, will benefit. So please join me in thanking Professor Tellman for this.